to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to the TheraTribe podcast. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Sandy.
Last time we talked some about what is trauma. We're going to get into some common symptoms that accompany trauma today.
Yeah, so we want to talk about really maybe looking at the big sort of categories of symptoms that happen to us. And then maybe we can talk about some specific symptoms as we go along. I also want to talk about some symptoms that are specific to all traumas. And then maybe we might be able to talk about maybe a handful of symptoms around people that have experienced complex trauma, which is a different type of trauma. So we might talk about that as we go along too, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Well,
let's get started.
Yeah, let's get started. So it's hard to be really excited about trauma.
Because, let's get excited.
Right.
Trauma.
Yeah. That doesn't feel really all that great.
Right.
Ooh, trauma. Yay. But
maybe get excited about working your way through it and coming out the other side of it.
Yes, that's what we can get behind.
If you've ever been through a significant car accident, you realize, we can actually work through this scar tissue and start feeling some mobility again. Yeah, that's something to be excited about. So
it is.
Stick around.
Yes, so it's not fun to hear what the physical therapist is going to do to you, but
or how many weeks
it'll take, but it is good to work through it. So when trauma happens, and if you remember from our last episode, we talked about trauma is just what we perceive to be trauma. That's what causes the symptoms, both in our bodies, well, actually our bodies, brains, and our emotions.
It almost as if the many are integrated.
Almost. One would think that we are integrated. Yeah. So
that's like, just as a brief aside, it's kind of funny to me that this is even still a thing. People talk about mind-body connection as if they are ever separate. I mean, like you're not like a balloon above a body.
Yes. Yeah. And yet when we think about our brain, it feels it's in the top of my head. Right. So of course it's separate from my body.
Right. Like the cartridge you press into the video game console.
Yes. Pretty much that's what it is. So it is definitely integrated and whole, even though we may not perceive it to be so. And so when trauma happens, it actually does impact the whole bit and not just one piece of the bit. It impacts the whole body, the whole brain, the whole emotions. The whole person is really how I see it. It impacts the whole person.
Is that to say the mind and the body all has a memory?
Yes, it definitely does say that. And actually, there's one of the best books out there by Bessel van der Kolk, Dr. van der Kolk, quote, "The body keeps the score," because our bodies do remember. Our emotions remember too. And it's kind of funny that they have memories, but they act as if they have memories. I'm not, anthropomorphizing, of course, our emotions, and yet our emotions do remember as well as our body. So our bodies actually hold. We're going to talk about that in future episodes about the physical effect of trauma on our bodies, and how long it goes. It can actually go to the end of life. So we want to talk about that in a future episode about the physical changes, but
because we have to build our way there.
We will have to build our way there, and maybe sometime we'll talk about epigenetics.
I'd love to talk about epigenetics.
Yes, I love to talk about that too.
That could probably be a series.
Probably, but anyway, back to common trauma symptoms. Knowing that we are integrated people, we are integrated as whole persons. When trauma happens, then it does impact us in some ways very negatively, or we show symptoms of trauma. It affects our thinking. For instance, we might have intrusive thoughts. We might have those thoughts that might be around, oh goodness, I'm going to be in another accident. Oh, here comes another car. I'm going to be in another accident. The world is a very random place, and danger might happen. Those thoughts may come in out of nowhere. I'm doing my work, and all of a sudden I think, oh, this is a dangerous place. Nothing has done that. It's an internal cognition. It also does that. We might have nightmares. Our brain is continuing to process that trauma and experience that trauma, and that'll come out in nightmares as well. Another thing, as I'm thinking about nightmares, which are a sleeping flashback, but we might have thinking flashbacks. We might see it happen. We might feel it happen. We'll talk about that more probably as we get into complex trauma. But flashbacks, we have a thing in our society where we think flashbacks are this whole cognitive picture of what happened. Sometimes we can have just emotional flashbacks. We just have that same feeling, but we're not seeing anything. And that can be very confusing for people that have experienced trauma, but it does happen.
I was going to say, when that's happening, I mean, how often do you find that people don't even know to connect those dots to say this is happening because this happened?
Actually, a lot of the time, most of the time, I've worked with probably thousands at this point, at least over 1,000 of people who have survived trauma of one way or another. And that is connecting all of these dots. It's almost impossible for most people. They don't have the knowledge base, and we can't expect them to. And in our society, if you have mood swings or you're at work and you're having trouble concentrating, then we ascribe that to a character flaw when really it is a physical and emotional and mental response to trauma at times, right?
That's it's when you zoom out and get some perspective, it becomes, I would say, increasingly strange how much we can get locked into a moment and judge ourselves based on the capacity we're experiencing in that moment with no regard for what led up to it or what variables we might not be taking into account even within that moment.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed. And on top of that, it's important to remember that when trauma happens, until we work through it, whenever we have these flashbacks, these mood swings, whenever we're so-called triggered, whenever we move into that, our body and our memory is as if that trauma is happening right now, always. Until you work through it, there is no time in trauma. We'll talk about in another episode about how it responds in our brains and our brain and body connection and how trauma works that way biologically. But there's a biological reason as to why when we are triggered or we're showing symptoms, we are back in that moment of time as if it were currently happening. And so if I'm sitting at work and I lose my concentration because my brain is back at this other moment in time as if it's happening, well, of course I've lost my my concentration. Of course I'm having mood swings. Of course I may be having distorted thoughts. Of course, I might actually start avoiding places that remind me of that. I might avoid the place where it happened. I might avoid similar places or people. If it were a trauma around people, maybe I would avoid men with beards, for instance, right? Depending on what happened.
Yeah.
And so I might start avoiding it and not realizing I'm avoiding. It's just would be like, I don't know why that guy just bothers me, but there's something in me. I just don't like him. I just don't like him.
Yeah.
Right. For no reason. It's just, I just don't like him. And it's most likely an avoidance from that trauma response.
And maybe we don't need to get just yet into all the terminology for what that can look like, but maybe we could talk a bit about what is a trigger and what is not a trigger.
Yeah. So a trigger is anything that can be external. That means it can happen outside of us, or internal, but it's something that causes us to remember a piece of the trauma. So it can be, doesn't have to be the whole trauma. And when I say remember, it can be that we remember it in our brain. So cognitively we remember it, or it can be that our body remembers it, or it could be that our emotions remember it. And it can be anything. It can be a thought that I have that can set that off. It can be the way that someone walks across the room, or a word, or I see something, I smell something. Smell can be a big trigger. If I think about junior high school, actually, anytime I smell Clearasil, the acne medicine, I literally am put back into junior high school. Tells you what I had around my nose the whole time during junior high school, right? That Clearasil, and there's a reason for that. So our brains does not filter anything from smell. It filters all the other senses.
What a thing that is.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy, but not crazy, right?
Right.
Crazy in the
maybe that's a word to unlearn. I'm not sure.
I know. It's crazy in the jargon sense, as in, wow, isn't that cool? Kind of in some way, but yeah, it's not crazy. It's actually our body's responding. So a trigger is literally when we've been triggered to a trauma. Now, I hear the word trigger used a lot now, and if someone just upsets you because you're mad at them, that's not a trigger. But triggers can actually be pretty small, and they're not something to sneer at because they are challenging to manage in life if you're being triggered while you're trying to go through life, right?
Yeah. So it seems like the idea of being triggered is a thing that can still be confusing sometimes for people. Like, think about it's a process to learn to ride a bike. You fall down. It's a process to learn to walk. You fall down. And I mean, I don't think most of us have vivid memories of each time we fell down while learning to do those things. So it can seem easy to kind of get it wrong as far as where to draw the line on what is considered triggered and what is not.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Triggering is anything that kind of bumps that trauma memory. That would be what a trigger is. So it's like I said, it can be anything at all, but it specifically bumps or runs into that trauma memory and reactivates it in us, in our memories, our bodies, and or our emotions.
So, and I wonder if you would change the phrasing of this at all, or if this sounds pretty faithful to what it is. Would you say that the trauma trigger is touching an experience either in your brain, the rest of your body, or both, that has said something's happening again that experiences taught me I'm not prepared to handle?
Yes, that is exactly what I would say. That's a good way of saying it. The whole concept of trauma means that we are feeling very helpless and hopeless in a situation without the resources to be able to cope and deal with it. That is the definition of trauma to some degree. And that can happen again through our perception. If we perceive that we're helpless and hopeless and we don't have the resources to manage or to deal with the situation or an event, then we become traumatized. So it is that. Our options may outside look larger than they look, or look more plentiful outside of the situation to other people. But if we are perceiving that we have no options, then it causes trauma.
Oh, can we talk a little bit about what's happening there when you get that like tunnel vision?
Well, it is because you've moved up into that fight flight. You've probably moved into closer to that dorsal vagal response, which we will talk about later.
We'll get into all the biochemical stuff. It'll be fun.
But you kind of freeze and you no longer, even with fight or flight, the thought behind that is I can do something, right? I can run away, I can fight. But when you move into that freeze area, when your dorsal vagal, the back part of this nerve, kind of your vagus nerve kind of activates, you begin to think, I can't. You move from I can to I can't. And so we know that people who have been traumatized, the number one thing that we know as therapists that we need to make sure that we offer is actually agency. Because trauma implies that there's a lack of choice.
And maybe we ought to define agency, because I'm not sure that that's in the common vocabulary of everybody listening.
Yeah, agency is basically the ability and the right, I guess, of being able to have personal choices to what happens to you and or your body, right? So that's agency. It's literally personal choice to direct your life in a way that is right for you. It's the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's right to make your own choices. It's the right to say yes or no to things. It's the right to say, I want to stay safe in my car. It's the right to say, I want to only have consensual sex. It's the right to say all of those things and then being able to say that effectively. And that's what happens. I say, no, I don't want this. And that does not happen, right?
Yeah.
But trauma, by definition, takes away our agency. It takes away any choice that we have in the event. We do know that people who have experienced trauma where they froze and there probably were things that they could have done, but they couldn't see it in the moment. They could have run away. They could have hit. We see that sometimes in sexual assault victims that may or may not have fought back. But those who fight back actually have an easier prognosis, a faster prognosis. They heal faster than those who were unable to fight back, because there's a lot of shame around that. But in either regard, their agency was stripped from them. And so it didn't matter whether they fought back or not, their agency was stripped from them, right?
Can make for complicated memories, though.
It really can do that. And it doesn't help that society also doesn't understand the response in the body in the middle of trauma, right?
Which, I mean, makes it even more important for us to learn to function on a level of recognizing that we're more than just this recognizable surface level life form. It's like there's so much more to who and what we are, that and you actually have to recognize that in order to even function in it.
Mhm, mhm. I think we've had a very two-dimensional view of humanity for a long time, and this discussion around trauma can also be, um, taken to other areas of life and played out there, because we aren't two-dimensional. We're not even three-dimensional. We're probably like, well, I could come up for a case for five-dimensional, but we're probably even more than that, right? We really don't know how many, but we are certainly not two-dimensional. And so recognizing that we are much more complex than previously thought. I mean, this is not new knowledge, but trauma work is actually fairly new within psychology and within biology. I occasionally do trainings for medical residents at teaching hospitals around the impact of trauma on people's biology and what that may look like in a doctor setting, in a hospital setting, how they can recognize it, and then how they can also practice in a trauma-informed way, because we're much more complex, right? So the symptoms are, I might be showing up with a headache, and severe headache time after time, and the doctor's trying to figure out what's going on with that. But it may actually be a trauma symptom, a trauma response.
Which makes it harder to diagnose for.
And treat, because until you actually fix the problem, you can malleate the symptom, but you can't really treat. It's going to continue I'm going to continue to have my headache, right? And who wants to live a life with a headache?
Yeah.
So.
And this is also, as another brief aside, this is also why you're going to hear, whether you come to TheraTribe or go to a different place for counseling, at some point you're probably going to hear your counselor say something to the effect of, I studied counseling, but you're the expert on your life. And so part of the process is helping you learn to tap into, all right, what's really going on inside of me? Because it's not all about learning or memorizing the right way to do a thing. It's like working with the operating system that you actually have to work with.
Yeah, I call it system maintenance with my clients, right? Because they're the only ones that can actually see what's inside of them. So the trauma symptoms and the trauma responses are so variable. Many times when we're working through trauma, I will ask the client, if they don't know what's going on in their emotions, I will just say, tell me what you feel in your body. And we'll start with that. A lot of times that's even easier than identifying what emotions they're feeling around that trauma, right? Or in a flashback, or when they've been triggered, right? Because our trauma symptoms are very, like I said, they hit every area of our lives. We may have trouble either falling asleep or staying asleep. We may have restless sleep. We may sleep too much. Maybe we sleep all the time, and it's a way of being in denial and not looking at things. our eating might change,
Mm,
for instance. And we might not put that together. Like you said, we may not connect the dots with our trauma. It's like, why am I eating more? Why am I eating less? Why am I
mm,
no longer eating this? And I only want that. It may very well be related to the trauma in some
mm,
kind of sometimes very imaginative ways, very creative ways is the way that we kind of we're so complex that sometimes we relate things together in our trauma responses without knowing that unconsciously, of course.
mm.
And
Could an example maybe be trying to fill a sense of emptiness by trying to fill yourself physically with food rather than recognizing an emotional emptiness?
could very, very well be. We've talked. Most of us have heard about young girls who have been molested who then eat a lot of food, and even though they're like 9, 10, 11 years old, they gain a lot of weight. And we've learned that it might be because they are trying to become unattractive to their molester.
Mm,
We've That's one way that it happens. Now that 9-year-old girl doesn't know that that's what she's doing. She may also be comforting herself with food. It is a matter of choice. Other young girls we know around eating patterns might become anorexic. That's one area in which they can control.
mm,
They're finding that agency, they're finding that control
yeah,
over what happens to them, they're emotionally or in their body, or it's around that kind of thing, for instance, right?
yeah. It seems like the thing we can at least kind of say is in a general sense just easy to see once you
Mhm.
know what you're looking at is like just how important it is to have your own sense of choice. And if agency has been taken away from you, it may have been taken away in a way that is hard for you yourself to recognize because the way that it was taken away from you might have been what was normal in my family or
Mhm.
whatever community you were part of. And that's not always, it doesn't always mean you need to villainize whatever system you were a part of. But if it resulted in you just plain not having a choice, then that could be reaping a bad harvest some years down the road that leaves you with a lot to untangle.
Mhm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think as we go further on into this series of podcasts, will most likely touch on the impact of developmental trauma and
Mm,
how that changes and what it takes from you, right? It does that, but those are part of the symptoms. Is you may not be able to understand how a healthy, functional family looks or what a relationship looks like, and how can you be a healthy, happy partner in a relationship, for instance. That's part of the symptom as well as the cost
mm.
of trauma for many people.
You want to touch on any other common symptoms before we wrap this one up?
Um, I think I think that we have a lot. I think if you have experienced trauma and you have things that are happening that didn't happen before, or if you have long-term trauma, for instance, childhood trauma, the developmental trauma, if you figure out that a lot of the things that you do may seem a little different than your buddies, right? You might want to check in with your therapist and see, because it can be um, very challenging to kind of put it down. But remember that trauma is usually responses are either what we call hyperarousal or hyper something. We're doing something a lot of. So it may be that we're hyper vigilant. We might sit, and always we have to have our back to the wall and we have to be able to watch the door. Um, our systems are aroused a lot. And so we may have a lot of restlessness, anxiety, panic attacks, things like that, nightmares, often like that. And then there are things that we might avoid. We might avoid our places. We might avoid thoughts. We might avoid feelings. We might avoid even conversations. We just may not realize that that's what we're doing.
Mm,
So that's really kind of the categories of trauma symptoms.
mm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Hope you learned something new. If you're recognizing that any of this has applied in your own life, that's probably a step of progress, even if it feels a little overwhelming right now. it's part of why we do what we do. We think it helps people to be able to have somebody walk them through this process. So, yeah, you can always reach out to TheraTribe or reach out to someone local if you're more comfortable with that. But yeah, if you're recognizing that you need help, there's nothing wrong with admitting it. And again, it's something to be excited about, to come out on the other side of some of this stuff.
Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. Please stay tuned for more.